Ziel erfassen. Schnell. Wir können nicht ewig warten.
Keep your eyes open. Check the rooftops.
Please sign here. And the date goes here.
April 1945. Southern Germany. The war has ended here, but the silence feels heavier than gunfire. Inside a converted schoolhouse, now ringed with barbed wire, rows of German women sit on wooden benches. Their coats hang loose, faces hollow, hands folded, not in prayer yet, just waiting. Some are barely out of their teens. Others carry the weight of years spent serving a collapsing regime. Clerks, nurses, auxiliaries, camp staff, all of them defeated, all of them uncertain what comes next. They expected anger. They expected judgment. Some expected revenge. Instead, an American chaplain steps forward. No shouting, no orders, just a quiet voice. A hymn begins, soft, unfamiliar in melody, but unmistakable in meaning. Words about mercy, about forgiveness, about grace offered to the undeserving. At first, the women do not react. They stare ahead, rigid. Indoctrination and fear still hold them upright. Then shoulders begin to shake. One woman lowers her head. Another presses her hand to her mouth. Tears fall, not from punishment, but from something far more disorienting. For the first time since the Reich collapsed, they're not being condemned. They're being forgiven. And that realization breaks them in a way the bombs never did. This moment did not happen in isolation. To understand why it mattered, and why it was so powerful, we must step back into the final months of a world at war. By the time those hymns were sung, Germany had already lost the war, long before the final surrender papers were signed. By late 1944, the Third Reich was collapsing under pressure from every direction. In the West, American, British, and Canadian forces had broken out of Normandy and were pushing steadily toward the Rhine. In the East, the Red Army was advancing with brutal speed, consuming entire German divisions and cities as it moved. The air above Germany belonged almost entirely to the Allies. Railways lay twisted. Fuel was scarce. Communications were unreliable. The state was fraying from the inside. Total war had reached its final, desperate phase. As German men were killed, captured, or pinned to shrinking fronts, the regime turned increasingly to women. By 1944, hundreds of thousands of German women were no longer only civilians. They were part of the war machine, officially and unofficially. Young women served as Flakhelferinnen, operating anti-aircraft batteries around cities and industrial centers. Others worked as radio operators, clerks, drivers, and messengers for the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. Many were nurses, trained hastily and sent into overwhelmed military hospitals. Some served as guards, secretaries, or support staff in camps and administrative offices. Millions more were mobilized in factories, farms, and civil defense. They were told this was duty. They were told this was survival. They were told this was destiny. For years, propaganda had framed the war as an existential struggle. Germany, they were told, was surrounded by enemies who would destroy it without mercy. The Allies were portrayed not as armies, but as forces of annihilation. Fear was cultivated deliberately, especially fear of capture. By 1945, that fear was all many German women had left. As Allied forces crossed into Germany itself, surrender became unavoidable. Entire units dissolved. Cities fell without resistance. Civilians fled westward, trying to escape the approaching Eastern Front. Others stayed, too exhausted or too rooted to move. When American forces advanced into central and southern Germany, they encountered not only soldiers, but masses of displaced people. Refugees, forced laborers, civilians, and women connected, directly or indirectly, to the German war effort. Captivity took many forms. Some women were taken prisoner because they were attached to military units. Others were detained for screening, questioning, or denazification. Some were arrested temporarily while camps, offices, and hospitals were secured. The lines between POW, detainee, and civilian were often blurred in the chaos of collapse. But what united these women was shock. The regime they had lived under since childhood was gone. Its symbols torn down. Its leaders either dead, fleeing, or captured. The certainty, however false, that had structured their lives vanished almost overnight. And in its place came silence. American policy toward prisoners and detainees differed sharply from what many Germans expected. The U.S. Army followed established rules for handling POWs, informed by the Geneva Conventions and reinforced by a broader ideological goal: to defeat Nazism without destroying German society entirely. This did not mean leniency in all cases. Screening was thorough. Suspected war criminals were separated. Conditions were often harsh due to shortages and devastation. But systematic revenge was not the objective. That distinction mattered. For German women steeped in years of propaganda, it was disorienting. They had been prepared for punishment. They had been prepared for humiliation. Some had been prepared to die rather than be captured. Instead, they were fed, counted, guarded, and, unexpectedly, spoken to calmly. Within American units, military chaplains were present everywhere the army went. Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish chaplains moved with frontline units, field hospitals, and detention camps. Their role was officially pastoral to tend to American soldiers. But in the wreckage of Germany, their presence reached further. They carried with them not weapons, but words. And sometimes, those words crossed enemy lines in ways no military order ever could. To understand how those hymns came to be sung, and why they struck so deeply, we must look more closely at American occupation practices and the moral framework guiding them in the final days of the war. When American forces moved into Germany in the spring of 1945, they did so with a mission that extended beyond military victory. Washington understood that how Germany was treated after defeat would shape Europe for decades. The destruction of Nazism was essential, but so was preventing the conditions that might give rise to another war. This thinking influenced how prisoners and detainees were handled, including women. The U.S. Army classified captives carefully. Uniformed personnel were processed as prisoners of war. Civilians and auxiliaries were often detained temporarily for screening, intelligence gathering, or denazification. In practice, the chaos of collapse blurred these distinctions. Makeshift camps appeared in schools, factories, barns, and former German military facilities. Some women stayed for days, others for weeks or months. Conditions varied widely. Food shortages were severe across Germany, and American forces struggled to feed not only their own troops, but millions of displaced persons. Rations were limited. Shelter was basic. Disease spread easily. Yet compared to conditions in the East or in the ruins of besieged cities, American-run facilities were often safer and more orderly. Crucially, they were predictable. American guards followed routines. Orders were issued clearly. Violence, when it occurred, was usually punished. This consistency slowly undermined years of propaganda that had portrayed Americans as savage occupiers. Alongside military administration came an unexpected presence: religion. Religion had not disappeared from Germany under the Third Reich, but it had been tightly constrained and politicized. Churches were monitored. Sermons were scrutinized. Independent moral authority was viewed with suspicion. By the final years of the war, faith had been largely subordinated to ideology, survival, or silence. American forces brought a different relationship to religion into occupied Germany. U.S. military chaplains were integral to Army life. They conducted services in foxholes, hospitals, and camps. They counseled soldiers before battle and sat with the dying afterward. Many saw their role as extending beyond nationality, an obligation to human dignity itself. As camps stabilized, chaplains were sometimes permitted to hold non-denominational services for detainees. These gatherings were not mandatory. They were not interrogations. They were framed as voluntary moments of reflection in an environment otherwise defined by uncertainty. For German women, the idea was unsettling. They arrived expecting accusation. Instead, they were offered hymns. The hymns chosen were often familiar in structure, but foreign in message. Translated or explained slowly, they spoke of themes absent from Nazi rhetoric. Forgiveness without conquest, mercy without victory, worth not earned through sacrifice or obedience, but granted freely. One commonly used hymn was Amazing Grace. Others centered on repentance, reconciliation, and the burden of guilt lifted through grace rather than punishment. These were not triumphal songs. They did not celebrate Allied victory. They did not reference Germany at all. They spoke to the human condition. Chaplains who later wrote about these services described an atmosphere unlike anything they had experienced in combat. There was no shouting, no confrontation. Often there was long silence. Many women did not sing. They listened, and listening was dangerous. Listening meant allowing space for thoughts long suppressed. Thoughts about what had been done, what had been believed, what had been lost, and what might never be forgiven. Some women had lost brothers, husbands, fiancés, dead on distant fronts or missing without graves. Others carried knowledge they had never spoken aloud, of camps nearby, of neighbors who vanished, of rumors that now appeared terrifyingly real. The hymns did not accuse them. That was precisely why they hurt. In the absence of accusation, defenses fell away. Tears came not from fear, but from recognition. For years, emotion had been disciplined into usefulness. Work, obedience, endurance. Here, emotion had no purpose. It simply existed. American observers noted that these moments did not feel like victory. They felt like aftermath. And in that quiet aftermath, something shifted. The war had ended with surrender. But for many of these women, the true end came later, when the language of forgiveness reached them before the language of judgment ever did. To grasp the full weight of this moment, we must now examine it from multiple angles, human, moral, and cultural, to understand why a simple hymn carried such power in the ruins of a defeated nation. By the time the hymns were sung, many of the women had already endured more than their bodies could process. For months, sometimes years, they had lived in a state of constant tension. Air raids by night, work details by day. News of defeats whispered or concealed. The war had demanded endurance without reflection. There was no room for grief, no space for doubt. Survival required emotional compression. Capture did not immediately release that pressure. In detention, fear simply changed shape. Uncertainty replaced urgency. Rumors circulated freely, stories of trials, of camps, of revenge. For women who had served in any official capacity, even peripherally, the fear was sharper. They did not know how they would be judged or by whom. When the chaplain began to sing, the emotional defenses they had constructed were already brittle. The hymns did not trigger tears immediately. At first, there was confusion. Some women stiffened, unsure whether this was another form of control. Others watched American guards closely, expecting mockery or reprisal. None came. Instead, the sound filled the room without demand. It did not instruct. It did not command. It simply existed. That absence of pressure was devastating. For many, it was the first moment since childhood when they were not being told what to feel or believe. The silence between verses allowed thoughts to surface unchallenged. Faces lowered, shoulders slumped. The war's emotional scaffolding, discipline, duty, obedience collapsed inward. Tears followed, not in dramatic bursts, but in quiet, uncontrollable streams. Some women covered their faces. Others stared at the floor as if ashamed of the relief they felt. The breakdown was not about religion alone. It was about permission to grieve, to doubt, to feel guilt without being annihilated by it. American observers later noted how sudden and total these reactions were. Women who had remained composed through bombardment and surrender now wept openly in a room where nothing was being demanded of them. That was the paradox. The war had trained them to withstand violence. It had not prepared them for mercy. The emotional impact of these hymns cannot be understood without examining how deeply ideology had shaped German women's inner lives. From an early age, many had been immersed in National Socialist organizations, the League of German Girls, wartime service groups, factory brigades. Loyalty was framed as virtue, sacrifice as honor, doubt as betrayal. Moral responsibility was externalized, defined by obedience rather than conscience. This framework offered certainty. It explained suffering. It justified loss. It promised meaning even in defeat. As long as one had done one's duty, judgment belonged to history, not the individual. The hymn shattered that logic. They spoke of personal accountability without collective condemnation, of guilt acknowledged without eternal damnation, of forgiveness that did not require ideological alignment or heroic death. For women raised on narratives of purity, struggle, and endurance, this was profoundly destabilizing. Forgiveness had never been part of the moral vocabulary they were given. Mercy was weakness. Compassion was conditional. Yet here it was, extended freely by the supposed enemy. Some women later described feeling exposed. Without ideology to shield them, they were forced to confront personal questions long avoided. What had they believed? What had they ignored? What had they excused? The hymns did not answer these questions. They made them unavoidable. That was their power. In the quiet of those makeshift halls, surrounded by others grappling with the same unspoken reckoning, ideology lost its grip. It could not compete with a message that addressed the individual soul rather than the collective cause. The collapse was not political. It was moral, and it was happening in real time. Yet the hymns did more than provoke emotional release or ideological disorientation. They functioned as a psychological force, one that intersected with American military culture and the unique role of chaplains in ways rarely acknowledged in conventional war histories. In war, sound is usually a weapon. Artillery announces destruction. Aircraft signal death from above. Commands strip individuality away. Even silence carries threat. Against this background, a hymn, slow, measured, and gentle, was something alien. For the German women who heard it, the shock was not theological. It was psychological. They had prepared themselves for interrogation, for accusation, for the grinding humiliation of defeat. What they encountered instead was language that assumed brokenness rather than guilt, and offered restoration rather than retribution. The hymns did not deny wrongdoing. They did not erase responsibility, but they reframed it. Sin, in this language, was not punished through annihilation. It was confronted through acknowledgement and release. That concept cut deep. Psychologically, it destabilized the expectation of justice as vengeance. Many women had internalized the belief that suffering must be paid for in kind. They expected pain to follow defeat, just as they had been taught that enemies deserved destruction. When pain did not come, the mind searched for meaning elsewhere. The hymns provided it. They allowed sorrow without rage, guilt without despair. They created space where grief could exist without justification. For individuals who had lived under totalizing ideology, this was profoundly disarming. Chaplains later observed that the emotional response often intensified during repeated services. The first exposure created confusion. The second brought tears. By the third, some women sang softly, tentatively, testing words they had not allowed themselves to speak aloud in years. This was not conversion in a dramatic sense. It was recognition. Recognition that the war's moral framework had failed them, and that another language existed, one that named suffering without demanding loyalty in return. American chaplains did not see themselves as instruments of policy. Yet their presence reflected a broader American belief that moral authority mattered in victory. During the Second World War, U.S. chaplains served under extraordinary conditions. They landed with assault troops, worked in field hospitals, and accompanied POW transports. Many had witnessed extreme violence. Some had buried hundreds of soldiers. Their understanding of enemy humanity was not abstract. Chaplains were trained to minister without discrimination. Official doctrine emphasized that spiritual care extended to all, regardless of nationality or guilt. In practice, this was complicated, but it shaped behavior. In camps holding German women, chaplains reported a sense of responsibility that went beyond duty. They recognized the psychological fragility of detainees who had lost not only a war, but a worldview. Offering hymns and scripture was not meant as instruction, but as stabilizing presence. Importantly, the hymns chosen avoided triumphalism. There are no victory songs, no references to American righteousness. The focus was inward, not political. This restraint was deliberate. Chaplains understood that victory already carried enough weight. What these women faced was collapse, not resistance. In memoirs and reports, chaplains described moments of doubt, wondering whether their presence was welcome or intrusive. Yet the reactions they witnessed removed ambiguity. Tears were not coerced. Silence was not enforced. The response came unbidden. For many chaplains, this was one of the most profound experiences of the war, not because it demonstrated American superiority, but because it revealed the shared vulnerability beneath uniforms and ideologies. In these moments, the war seemed briefly suspended, replaced by a fragile encounter between conqueror and conquered that did not resemble conquest at all. Perhaps the most enduring effect of these hymns was the way they quietly redrew the boundary between enemy and human being. The women were no longer symbols of a defeated regime. They were listeners, grievers, individuals reckoning with loss and guilt. American guards noticed the change. After services, behavior shifted subtly. There was less defiance, less withdrawal. Eye contact became possible. Small gestures, requests, thanks, returned. This was not submission. It was rehumanization, and it worked both ways. Soldiers who had fought through brutal campaigns now saw the faces of the people they had been trained to defeat, not as enemies in propaganda, but as exhausted individuals carrying emotional scars as deep as their own. The hymns did not end the war, but they changed its final tone. The full weight of that change became visible in a single, defining moment, when emotion overtook restraint and the psychological barriers of defeat finally gave way. That moment marked the true turning point of this story. The decisive moment did not arrive with an order, a verdict, or a declaration. It arrived quietly. The room was plain, bare walls, high windows, benches scarred by years of use. Outside, the war's debris still littered the landscape. Inside, the air was heavy with exhaustion and restraint. American guards stood along the perimeter, weapons slung but unused. A chaplain stood at the front, not elevated, not commanding attention. He began again. The melody was steady, unhurried, the kind of tempo that refuses to be rushed. Each note carried space between it, space that allowed thought to enter. The words followed. They spoke of burdens laid down, of debts not repaid through suffering, of forgiveness extended before it is deserved. The language moved slowly, translated when necessary, explained in fragments. Many of the women understood enough without translation. Christian hymns had once been part of German life, before ideology stripped them of moral independence. The phrasing was familiar, Yet the meaning now landed differently. At first, the women sat rigid. Years of discipline held their posture in place. These were bodies trained to endure bombardment, hunger, loss. The Reich had demanded control over emotion. Control had become survival. Then one woman's breathing changed. It was subtle, a catch in the chest, a pause that came too late to suppress. Her shoulders tightened as if bracing for something unseen. She pressed her lips together, but the effort failed. Tears escaped despite resistance. Another woman noticed. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see. Her eyes filled almost instantly, as though recognition had been waiting for permission. She lowered her gaze, ashamed of the weakness she had been taught to despise. The hymn continued. No one stopped. No one intervened. The sound of crying spread, not as noise, but as presence. Quiet sobs, shaking breaths, hands clasped tightly in laps, knuckles pale. Some women leaned forward, elbows on knees, heads bowed. Not in performance, but in collapse. This was not hysteria. It was release. Years of fear unraveled in minutes. Fear of bombings. Fear of denunciation. Fear of the future. Fear of being judged by history, by others, by themselves. The hymn did not erase these fears. It loosened their hold. The chaplain did not raise his voice. He did not stop when the crying began. He continued, steady and calm, as though the tears were not interruption, but response. As though this was exactly what the words were meant to reach. American guards shifted uneasily. Some looked away. Others watched, unsure what they were witnessing. This was not surrender. This was not compliance. It was something neither side had anticipated. One guard later recalled that the room felt smaller, not oppressive, but intimate, as if the walls had drawn closer to contain what was happening inside them. When the hymn ended, there was no applause. There was silence, a long, unbroken silence that carried more weight than sound. No one moved. No one spoke. The women remained seated, many still crying softly, as if afraid that standing would shatter the fragile equilibrium they had just reached. The chaplain waited. Then quietly he spoke, not of guilt, not of judgment, but of human frailty, of war's damage to both victors and defeated, of the burden carried by those who survive. He did not absolve them. He did not accuse them. He acknowledged them. That acknowledgement was the turning point, because in that moment, the women understood something that ideology had never allowed, that their suffering did not require justification through obedience or sacrifice, that grief could exist without serving a cause, that forgiveness did not erase responsibility, but it made endurance possible. The war had ended on paper weeks later, but for these women, something else ended here. What followed would deepen this moment, transforming private breakdown into collective reckoning, and leaving an imprint that neither side would forget. The silence after the hymn did not dissolve quickly. It lingered, heavy but not hostile. No orders were given. No one was dismissed. The women remained seated, suspended between what they had been and what they no longer knew how to be. The war had stripped them of certainty. The hymn had stripped them of defense. Some wiped their faces with the backs of their hands, embarrassed by the exposure. Others made no effort to stop the tears. There was no point. Control had already been lost, and in that loss, something else had been gained. The chaplain spoke again, but briefly. His words were measured, careful not to intrude on what had already occurred. He reminded them that suffering did not invalidate humanity. That defeat did not erase worth. That responsibility and mercy were not opposites. Then he stepped back. The service ended not with dismissal, but with stillness. The women stood slowly. Movements were tentative, as if gravity itself had shifted. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked directly at the American guards, searching for reaction, confirmation that what had just happened would not be punished or ridiculed. None came. The guards remained neutral, professional, silent. That silence reinforced the moment rather than undoing it. As the women filed out, the emotional weight followed them. Conversations did not resume immediately. Instead, small clusters formed outside. Whispered exchanges, brief touches on shoulders, glances that said more than words could carry. For many, this was the first time they had allowed themselves to speak honestly since the war began. Not about victory, not about sacrifice, but about fear. Some admitted they had expected death or humiliation in captivity. Others spoke of shame, of not knowing what to feel now that the regime was gone. A few voiced guilt cautiously, testing whether it was safe to name it. The hymns had not told them what to think. They had given them permission to think it all. American personnel noticed changes in the days that followed. Tension decreased. Defiance softened. Requests replaced demands. The atmosphere in the camp shifted, not toward submission, but toward stability. This was not accidental. Psychologically, the moment had functioned as a release valve. Trauma that had been locked behind discipline and ideology was allowed expression. In doing so, it reduced the pressure that often fuels resentment and rage. Chaplains recorded these observations in reports and letters. Some described the experience as more emotionally difficult than combat. In battle, fear is externalized. Here, it was internal and contagious. One chaplain wrote that he felt as though he had walked into the aftermath of a storm rather than the storm itself. The destruction had already occurred. What he witnessed was reckoning. Not all women reacted the same way. Some remained distant. Some refused to attend future services. Some sat through them without visible response. But even among these, the expectation of punishment had been quietly challenged. The psychological narrative had shifted. They were no longer bracing for inevitable cruelty. They were confronting uncertainty and, with it, responsibility. That distinction mattered deeply in the post-war landscape. Allied authorities understood that rebuilding Germany required more than physical reconstruction. It required moral and psychological stabilization. Denazification programs would address ideology. Courts would address crimes. But moments like this address something else entirely. They address the inner collapse that no tribunal could reach. For the American soldiers who witnessed it, the experience altered their understanding of victory. Many had entered Germany carrying anger and grief of their own. Friends lost, homes left behind, years stolen by war. Watching former enemies break, not under threat, but under mercy, forced a recalibration. Hatred became harder to sustain in the face of shared vulnerability. This did not erase accountability. It did not excuse atrocity. It complicated the emotional landscape of victory in ways few had anticipated. The war had taught them how to destroy. This moment taught them how to stop. And stopping, truly stopping, proved to be its own kind of challenge. The consequences of this turning point did not end with tears or temporary calm. They extended into the days, months, and years that followed, shaping how defeat was processed, how responsibility was confronted, and how reconciliation began. In the days that followed the services, the effects did not fade. They settled. Life inside American-run detention facilities continued much as before. Rations distributed, roll calls conducted, screenings carried out. Yet beneath the routine, a subtle shift had occurred. Emotional volatility decreased. The atmosphere grew quieter, more reflective. The hysteria that Allied authorities feared in large captive populations did not materialize here. This was not coincidence. Psychological stabilization was one of the unspoken goals of occupation, even if it was rarely articulated in such terms. Chaos bred resentment. Resentment bred resistance. The American command understood that managing the aftermath of victory required restraint as much as force. For the women who had wept during the hymns, the immediate aftermath was complex. Some experienced relief, an emotional exhaustion that followed release. Others felt exposed, unsettled by how easily control had slipped away. A few reacted with delayed anger, struggling to reconcile mercy with the enormity of what had been lost. But across these responses, one pattern recurred. Fear no longer dominated. The expectation of cruelty had been disrupted. This mattered deeply for women facing uncertain futures. Many did not know whether they would be released, transferred, or interrogated further. Some feared association with Nazi institutions would define them permanently. Instead, procedures unfolded methodically. Women were questioned, categorized, and often released once their roles were clarified. Nurses returned to ruined hospitals. Clerks were dismissed. Auxiliary personnel were repatriated to hometowns that barely existed anymore. Those suspected of involvement in crimes were detained longer, separated, and investigated. The hymns had not shielded anyone from accountability. They had prepared them for it. By allowing emotional collapse in a controlled environment, they reduced the likelihood of denial, defiance, or psychological breakdown later. This had tangible consequences for denazification efforts, which depended on testimony, acknowledgement, and compliance. Allied psychologists and chaplains later noted that individuals who had undergone emotional release were more capable of engaging with difficult truths. Guilt acknowledged privately became responsibility confronted publicly. For American authorities, this was an unexpected outcome. The services were never intended as tools of policy. Yet they aligned with broader occupation goals: demilitarization, denazification, and democratization. Moral disarmament preceded ideological dismantling. The women themselves carried the aftermath differently. Some spoke of the hymns years later as the moment the war truly ended for them. Not surrender, not capture, not liberation, but recognition. Recognition that their suffering, though real, did not absolve them, and that their guilt, though heavy, did not erase them. Others never spoke of it at all. Shame and memory often coexist uneasily. In post-war Germany, silence became common. Many women returned to daily life without language to describe what they had felt. Reconstruction demanded labor, not reflection. Survival reclaimed priority. Yet the imprint remained. For some, faith returned, not necessarily to organized religion, but to moral frameworks not defined by obedience or fear. For others, the experience hardened skepticism. Mercy received could feel undeserved, even manipulative. But even in these cases, the psychological rupture remained irreversible. The old certainties were gone, and in their absence, something fragile but real had emerged: the possibility of moral agency independent of ideology. The longer-term consequences of this shift would not become visible immediately. They unfolded slowly across years of rebuilding, remembrance, and reconciliation, shaping not only individual lives, but the collective memory of a defeated nation. As months turned into years, the memory of those hymns did not remain isolated to the camps where they were first heard. They traveled with the women who had listened, back into ruined cities, into overcrowded apartments, into a society struggling to redefine itself after moral collapse. Post-war Germany was marked by exhaustion. Physical reconstruction dominated daily life. Rubble had to be cleared. Food had to be found. Children had to be fed. In this environment, reflection was often postponed. Survival came first. Yet beneath the surface, psychological transformation was underway. Denazification programs forced confrontation with the past, but they were administrative by nature: forms, hearings, classifications. What they could not reach was the internal reckoning that many women had begun earlier, in silence, when forgiveness had been offered before judgment. For some, that moment became a private reference point. When accusations surfaced against neighbors, former colleagues, institutions, they remembered the contrast between expected condemnation and unexpected mercy. This did not excuse crimes, but it altered how responsibility was processed. Rather than denial, there was acknowledgement. Rather than rage, there was grief. Rather than defiance, there was endurance. This was not universal. Post-war Germany was fragmented in memory and response. Many rejected guilt entirely. Others internalized it so deeply that it became paralyzing. But among those who had experienced moments of moral release during captivity, a different pattern sometimes emerged, one marked by quiet acceptance rather than ideological retreat. Religious communities in post-war Germany would later note an influx of individuals seeking frameworks that emphasized reconciliation over triumph. Church attendance rose unevenly, but meaningfully in certain regions. Sermons shifted tone from national survival to personal responsibility. The hymns echoed faintly in these changes. For American veterans, the memory endured as well. Many returned home carrying images not only of battle, but of those moments when the enemy ceased to be abstract. In letters and memoirs, soldiers and chaplains alike reflected on how difficult it had been to reconcile their wartime anger with the vulnerability they had witnessed. Some described it as unsettling, others as necessary. Victory, they realized, did not end with surrender. It ended when hatred no longer dictated behavior. In this sense, the hymns functioned as a bridge, not between nations, but between moral states. This perspective influenced how the United States approached post-war Europe more broadly. The Marshall Plan, often discussed in economic terms, was also a moral project. It assumed that recovery required dignity, not humiliation. That rebuilding demanded trust, not permanent punishment. The seeds of that philosophy were present in small, unrecorded moments, like a room full of defeated women hearing words they never expected from those who had won. Over time, those women became mothers, workers, teachers, caretakers. They did not all become storytellers of their experience. Silence often prevailed. But silence does not erase memory. It stores it, and stored memory shapes behavior quietly. The generation that followed would grow up in a Germany wary of absolutes, cautious of ideology, skeptical of moral certainty imposed from above. That skepticism had many sources, but among them were moments when authority chose mercy over dominance. The hymns did not rewrite history. They did not balance the scales, but they softened the edges of defeat enough to allow something else to grow. To understand what this moment ultimately means, not just for those who lived it, but for the way wars end and societies rebuild, we must step back and reflect on its broader significance. Wars are often remembered by their noise, by explosions, by speeches, by borders redrawn in ink after being soaked in blood. But history is also shaped by quieter moments, moments that leave no monuments, no official records, and yet alter the emotional trajectory of those who experience them. The hymns sung in American-run detention camps in 1945 were such moments. They did not erase guilt. They did not undo suffering. They did not absolve crimes. What they did was interrupt the cycle that war depends on. The belief that violence must be answered with humiliation, that defeat must be sealed with despair. In offering forgiveness before judgment, these hymns confronted individuals not as enemies, but as humans standing amid the ruins of belief. For the German women who wept, the tears were not a sign of weakness. They were a response to something long denied, the possibility that moral reckoning could occur without annihilation. That responsibility could coexist with mercy. That survival did not require silence or denial. For the Americans who witnessed it, the moment complicated victory. It revealed that power carried obligation, that how one wins shapes what follows. In choosing restraint over domination, they affirmed a principle older than any army, that dignity preserved in defeat can become the foundation of peace. The Second World War ended through force. Its aftermath depended on something else. Reconciliation does not begin in treaties. It begins in recognition, in the quiet acknowledgement of shared frailty, spoken without accusation. The hymns offer that language when no other words could reach. In the end, this story is not about religion alone. It is about the human capacity to confront collapse without surrendering to hatred, about the thin line between justice and vengeance, and about the rare moments when history pauses long enough for conscience to speak. The women eventually left the camps. The soldiers went home. The buildings were repurposed or torn down. But the sound of those hymns, soft, steady, unforgiving of pretense, remained, not as memory of defeat, but as evidence that even at the end of the most destructive war in human history, mercy was still possible, and that sometimes it changed everything.